I am presenting the literature review session, and this is part 2. So you will recall that many of you would have watched the first installment that had an introductory overview of preliminary literature reviews and some basic introductory elements that relate to the art or the science of writing literature reviews. As per the first session, the promise was that you would have a second session that looks at much more critical literature reviewing skills, and we do that using the framework of an extended literature review as the basis of what I will be teaching you about. In simple terms, the first session helped you to just understand the basic tenets of literature reviews, and also to understand how you would go about writing a short review that you use for your proposal. But of course, some of you are already past the proposal phase and are in fact writing chapter 2 of your dissertation or your thesis. And it is that which is covered here in part 2, the extended literature review. As per usual with these sessions, I will begin with just some basic administrative things. You will probably be getting this as an asynchronous recording, and by that I mean it's a recording I'm doing at a time that will be different from when you watch it, primarily because we've had some problems with the reliability of electricity and so forth. So once again, whenever people watch the sessions, they write to me asking about when the sessions will be emailed to them and so forth. We tend to leave it for a week or so before we email a PDF version of the session to everybody. So please, folks, give it a chance to get to you. Also, if you have access to the session, you should in essence have the presentation, but it will be supported by this audio. I will, of course, leave an opportunity at the end for questions to be asked. But at this point, the thing to just share with you is that I will be turning off the video while I do the actual presentation, and we'll continue by speaking through the different slides that you have in front of you. So to everybody, welcome once again to the extended literature review. This is part 2 of a 2-part series on reviewing literature. Now, as always, you will remember that I constantly speak about being able to give some definitional introduction when it comes to any concept that we're looking at. So we will do a little bit of that in relation to literature reviews, even though we did a much more explicit attendance to this in the first session. So for many of you who did not watch the first session, I strongly recommend that you make sure you access that, because it is only then that you will have a much more clearer appreciation of some of the content that is covered in this second part. Those of you who don't know me, my name is Tennyson Mokuchini. I'm your facilitator today, and I also happen to be the project leader for this accelerated online postgraduate support program that you are a participant in. Now, as always, with each of the sessions that I present to you, I try to give you a list of expectations, and this is just to give you an overview of what I expect to cover, and I will also run through some of the things that I hope you'll be able to speak to once the session is finished. So the first thing is I will very, very quickly locate the literature review that I'm talking about within the full research process. So I will do a very synaptic overview of the different steps of the research process and then explain to you where the literature review that we're referring to would normally reside. Of course, the session on research processes is something that has already been covered at some point. And within this session, you will just be getting a summarized overview of that. Then, as you will probably have become aware, when you do reviewing of literature, you tend to look at literature from different sources, and there are methods that are universally used to decide how credible the different sources that you're using would be. So this is what I'm referring to when I speak to the hierarchy of evidence. Then I speak through the issue around critical appraisal, and critical appraisal relates to you critically assessing the strengths and the weaknesses of the literature that you have in front of you. So if you have a paper, you have a journal article, critical appraisal refers to the set of questions you would ask of that paper to determine its credibility, to determine its strengths, its weaknesses, and so forth. Then we'll do a quick walk through some of the typologies within literature reviews. This is an acknowledgement that when we speak about literature reviews, there are subcategories or different types of literature reviews that exist, and I will share what those are. Then what I have done is usually, if I was presenting this to a much smaller audience, there are typical questions and issues that people pose. I have set up a latter part of the session that just has slides, which I hope will answer some of the questions I expect you to have, but the slides have not been included into the main session because they are not necessary, but I know that at some level and some way, the questions related to them seem to always come up. Now, of course, the learning outcomes that you have in front of you are depicting what I've already indicated will be covered in the session. We'll define what a literature review is, speak about their importance, and this is really a revisiting of what has already been attended to. We'll speak about the hierarchy of evidence and other types of tools that are used to determine the authenticity, the credibility, and the type of evidence that you are reviewing whenever you carry out critical reviews such as this. Then, of course, I spoke about the different typologies, and this should assist you to work out where your own particular intended review falls. And then I will very quickly walk through some elements of the extended literature review so you get a sense of that. Now, I have put up the steps within the research process, primarily just as a way of jogging your memory and also as a way of reminding you exactly where literature reviews exist and what purpose they serve within the bigger scheme of things. So you will see that in many ways, the research process is made up of very few steps that some have broken up into many more phases, but ultimately the first phase of your study is where you decide on the topic you want, you conceptualize the problem, and then once you have done that, the next phase is where you plan your intended approach to understanding this problem. So this is where you would give an overview of your intended methodology. Then after that, the next step is what they call the empiric phase, and that's the phase where you actually do data collection, you actually do all the investigative work that you will be using as a basis of the data that you will later analyze. Then, of course, after the empiric phase, people talk about the analytic phase, and that's the phase where you analyze the data that you have in front of you. And finally, the last phase relates to dissemination. So you will see that the steps I have in front of you are separated into 7 micro steps, but they all basically go from conceptualization, planning of your study, the empirical phase of your study, the analytical phase of your study, and the dissemination phase of your study. So when it relates to literature reviews, you can expect that the review I am talking about exists literally in what would be step 2 of the steps within the research process that you have in front of you. So this literature review I'm talking about is one that you conduct when you're developing an overview of topic and the key questions that are represented and asked within that topic. Now, I'm taking you back to phase 1, which is the conception part of the phase of the study. And in this, you see that we talk about the 4 steps of conception, the first part of the research process, where you formulate your research problem, you determine the purpose of your study, you search, review literature related to the research problem. And that is this phase 2 of this phase of conception. Step 2 of this phase of conception is what we're concerned with when we speak about the literature review as we intend to be looking at it today. And the aim of this step really is to look at older and prominent literature and more recent literature to get a sense or a critical overview of the research problem. And when I say critical overview, I'm talking about you having an awareness of the arguments, the different approaches, the theories that have been put forward, and the seminal studies that help us to understand or to gain a thorough overview of the topic that is at hand. You also, as part of this second step, you look at the literature in relation to the things you're interested in and wonder and identify if there are any specific areas where there seems to be a gap in knowledge. So, and then of course, one would expect that the study you propose or the study you do is a study that is aligned or at least represents one of the areas that you identified as gaps in knowledge. So this is just to set the scene in relation to where a literature review would occur. Now, once the scene is set, one then takes us back to what a definition of a literature review is. And I share this definition for maybe the second or third time now in the series of lectures that I've provided to you, but I share it with the prime expectation that I actually give you yet another opportunity to see how definitions can help to shape or map out the expected behaviors that relate to anything or a phenomena that has been defined. So when we talk about a literature review, you'll notice that we refer to it as being a comprehensive summary. So don't forget that comprehensive nature of a literature review, that we expect that you will at the very least filter out the things that matter or not matter, but having started from a very comprehensive overview of studies that are done in relation to the topic you're interested in. Then, of course, literature review surveys scholarly articles, books, and other sources relevant to a particular area of research or to a particular research question. Then the research should enumerate, describe, summarize, and objectively evaluate and clarify this previous research. So what we're basically saying is that in your study or in your review, you will give us a sense of the extent to which particular literature exists in relation to a topic. You will describe that literature, you will summarize it, and you will objectively critique each of the different sources of literature to get a sense of what the key arguments are, to get a sense of what has been said or not been said about a topic, to get a sense about what the arguments that exist in relation to that topic are, and those types of things. And this is all to give you a summative overview of what is understood when it comes to a specific topic and what is missing from our current understanding as it relates to that chosen specific topic. Now, that all seems like a mouthful, but in essence, that is really what literature reviews are about. They're about comprehensively summarizing previous research, but as you do that, you do it by looking at scholarly articles, you do it by looking at books, you look at other sources, and you objectively evaluate all these sources by using a combination of you describing the sources a little bit, summarizing them a little bit, and critically evaluating how well done the actual chosen methods are, and if indeed the way that they are written and presented makes the expected academic sense that one would expect from a scholarly piece of work. Now, so once again, I reiterate, this slide pretty much covers what has already been covered in relation to what literature reviews are. The one standout issue from this that matters is that you must know that literature reviews are not what some people have described, and the one common mistake that we believe or we see in people's submissions around literature reviews is that they somehow think that a literature review is just a list of all material published or a summary of that material. A literature review is not that. It is not just an innate list. It is a representation of a list of things, but you critique them, you evaluate them, you relate them to your question, you make an assessment of what contribution they are making to the bigger understanding of your topic area. You will notice that the slide also does the same, but now what I do is I've presented the objectives of literature reviews. And those objectives are pretty much what has been covered in the definition of what a literature review is. And for you, the person who writes it, it is your opportunity to show me as your reader that you have an in-depth grasp of the subject or the phenomena you're looking at or the set of questions you're interested in, and that you understand how your own proposed research fits into the current and existing sets of knowledge that are there, and also how your current research adds to this existing body of agreed knowledge. And of course, people would say, why on earth do we do that? And remember, I did say that the first type of review, the preliminary review, that is not the subject of this moment, is really to provide an overview of the topic, is really to assert that the topic you've chosen is indeed viable. So that type of review will have a lot of statistical defense to support the chosen problem. But in general terms, much more specific terms, when it relates to literature reviewing as part of the extended literature review, your literature review is to demonstrate that you're familiar with the body of knowledge and to actually be able to locate previous work and how that relates in terms of the work you are proposing. Then you intend to summarize prior research and specify how your project is linked to that prior research. Then to integrate and summarize what is known about a subject, and then to demonstrate that you have learned from looking at all the other pieces to get a sense of what the best practices are, and that you have been able now to see your research as being the point of jettison for future other studies that relate to a similar topic area. Now that we know what a literature review is, the next thing people would ask is, what are the steps within one? The first step is, of course, determining the review questions. This is a combination of your introduction to your study, where you introduce the problem that you have. You very quickly do a preliminary overview of what is known or seems to continue to be a problem. And then on the basis of that, you are able to say, right, these are the things that continue to not be known. And in my review, I'm interested to find out if those things have indeed been exploited or exposed by others that have looked at this field. Of course, your review questions are also intrinsically linked to the objectives of your study, in that many people will have literature review questions that are essentially one of the objectives, but turned into a question format. So this first step is you determine these review questions. Then the second step of any literature review is where you develop a data search strategy. This is basically an identification by you of the steps that you intend to take and the order in which you'll take certain steps to search for that data that you need and are expecting to review as the main body of your literature review. Then, of course, one of the things that happens as part of your data search and the strategy that you put around that is that you develop a set of words or terms that you believe best describe what it is you're getting into. So the next step, one of the steps within the data search strategy, is where you explain to the reader the key terms and the key words that were used to determine what will be accepted or not accepted as a paper within your review. Also, you create inclusion and exclusion criteria, and these are the criteria that you will utilize to actually be much more clear that the things that make it to your final review are indeed things that have topic areas and focus areas that are related to your work. Then, of course, the next step after you've got this criteria is you will end up with the studies that meet your criteria. Once you have those studies or that literature, you then appraise it. You read it all and you assess and basically pose questions to it to make a determination about the quality of contribution that each of these papers is making, the answers that it provides in relation to your phenomena of interest, and of course, any other things that are exposed by the literature. For example, the fact that there are areas of knowledge that appear to still be gaps that have not been explored or appropriately attended to by others within your study area. Then when you have appraised these different studies, you get a sense now you have an ability to summarize the emergent themes, and you can look at themes of what it is that the different research has agreed on and what it is that the different research disagrees on, where the gaps in knowledge are. And then, of course, the final step that we have in front of you relates to you drawing out all the things that appear to still be contested within your study area so that you can highlight potential directions for future research. So basically this slide captures all the steps within a literature review, and what I will now do is cover some of the elements that you need to have in front of you as you prepare for this. As you prepare yourself for the way forward with your literature review. Now, as I have made mention, the process of reviewing literature is often described as if it's people just sit with papers and they ask all these questions, and then once they've asked those questions, they go out and write a report. But actually, it's a little bit more complicated than that. In fact, you'll be happy to know that the complications actually have given rise to different types of literature reviews. So those different types, once I share with you some of the common types that exist, it will help you to frame your work. It helps you to also frame the way in which you will approach and write up the process of you reviewing literature. And so up to date, there's at least 35 or so typologies, different types. There are 35 different types, but for the purposes of your level of study, either be it a master's or a doctorate, the tendency is that there's 5 or 6 types that are usually implicated. And this is what I will do here. I will cover those 5 or 6. Right. Now, here are the different 5 or 6, well, 6 or 7 types of literature review typologies. And this is basically a way of saying, look, when you write literature reviews, they will take the shape or they'll be structured according to the type of literature review you have chosen. So I will briefly walk you through the 6 or 7, and I urge you as individuals to go outside of this presentation and pursue, Google some of these terms and read up a little bit about each. But for the purposes of this session, I will speak through some of the 5 or 6, but the actual presentation that you have in front of you covers all 7 that I speak about here. So the next few slides cover all those 7, but I will use this singular slide to talk through each of the different typologies, knowing that when I'm not around and you need to access this, you can actually go to the individual pages where each of the different typologies are. So the first type of literature review, and perhaps the simplest and maybe least favored by many, is what they call a chronological review. A chronological review, is the secret is shared by the word chronology there, refers to a review in which the presentation of evidence follows a time-based order. And what I mean by that, when I say it follows a time-based order, is that I am saying that the reviewer will make an explicit decision and choice that the review of work that they conduct will be such that the papers or the literature they share with us is presented along a time continuum. So you would, with a chronological review, you may find that when people review literature, they give you the papers that were written the furthest away, like the oldest papers may be presented first, and as they progress with the literature that they're reviewing, they bring us closer and closer to the present day. So you would find that the literature review, if it's a chronological review, literally just reviews material from the 1970s followed by material from the 1980s, material from the 1990s, and so forth. And what that basically shows you is that the unit of review is the time, the chronology of work that is being looked at. Clearly, everyone who chooses any type of literature review has to defend why it is that they've decided that they will stack everything together by virtue of its date of publication, as it were. And so with chronological reviews, people would argue that they're using a chronological review because the topic they are focusing on might have evolved over time in a way that has explicitly got something to do with time and nothing else. So take, for example, if you were doing a literature review where you wanted to chart the world's understanding of the COVID virus as we know it now, you could say, look, since the virus came out some 1.5 years ago or so, our understanding and the literature that has existed has changed, because the more we know, the more we say things and write about things in different ways. So you might decide that for the purposes of doing a review related to COVID, you will use a chronological typology, which then means that you will review the papers and the literature, but you will review it in an order that is governed by time, by the publication date. This is, of course, quite a weak, in the world of reviews, it's seen as being quite a weak type of reviewing things, that you just stack together early things away from the new things. And it's a type of review format that people discourage the use of if you're using it as the only typology. So that brings me on to another acknowledgement, and this acknowledgement is that in as much as I am showing you the different types of literature reviews, it is possible that within one literature review, a person would have one dominant typology, but utilize characteristics of another. And I will revisit this when I do the other typologies so you can see what I'm talking to. Now, the next type of review that they speak about is what they call a narrative review. And a narrative review is no different from a review that focuses on things according to the different themes or thematic ideas that are presented. So you may find that someone will say, look, my review is looking at causes of violence among children. And you may actually say in the first theme suggests that the cause of violence from a child has to do with that person's predominant personality. So that's theme one. All the studies that blame the actual genetic makeup of the child become the ones that you look at and review, and you critically assess in relation to the first theme of your literature review. Then maybe the second theme may be that you're saying violence is not the product of biology, but it is the product of the way people are socialized. So then in a narrative review, your second theme will be the social basis of violence. And in that theme, you look at all the studies and all the research that seems to debate and talk about how social circumstance and socialization play a role in the way that people have a propensity to violence. Maybe the third theme would be that you're saying no, violence has nothing to do with the way we're socialized, but it has more to do with the media sensationalization of people who are violent. So then the third theme would be to do with violence and the influence of media. And then you would look at all the papers that have referred to media in their explanation or exploration of violence. So that is a narrative review. It's a review where the work and the review of particular elements is done in different themes. So you didn't use the chronology, you didn't just review everything that was old up until you got to the new. This time you used themes, or you narrated your review in relation to those themes. A critical review, which is a third type, is somewhat similar to a thematic review, but unlike the thematic review where people look at themes, you might actually have a critical review where the different sections of the review are trying to answer critical questions. So maybe in the same review that you are doing to do with violence, a critical review might have as the first section, it might have the first part might be to do with you trying to answer the question of whether violence is a learned thing or whether it is an inherited attribute. So if you look at all the studies that are trying to decipher whether violence is learned or whether it is something that we inherit, when you try to look at all those studies, you are essentially engaging in a critical review. So a critical review is a review where the different sections and the progression of the review are based on a person the reviewer attempting to answer different critical questions that have been asked in relation to the phenomena that they are interested in. So in many ways, if you look at this, the narrative review and the critical review are similar, but the narrative review talks about different themes, and those themes are themes as reflected by statements. So you may have a statement that says, media is a causal influence to violence. That you would see in a narrative review. But a critical review would maybe have a section that says, what is the role of media in predicting violence? They're essentially covering the same thing, but one is really explicit in that it is covering questions, critical questions that are being asked by those in the field. Then the next typology is the scoping review, and the scoping review relates to a review typology in which the reviewer is interested in giving an overview. And when an overview, a bird's eye view of what it is that is going on. So a scoping review will just give you an overview of a topic from the very generalized understanding of what's going on to a much more locally based understanding. So it's a funnel type review where you're not basing the review on chronology, on narrations, on critical questions. You are doing the review on the basis of generic positions and areas of interest that exist for a particular topic. So that's what a scoping review is. Sometimes a scoping review is made, people will refer to that as being what is the same as the preliminary review that I spoke to you about. So when I said that there's a preliminary review that people do in relation to a topic, a scoping review is similar to that in that it just gives a generalized overview of the topic area. And in a scoping review, you will see symptoms of a chronological approach, symptoms of a narrative approach, symptoms of a critical approach. The primary job of a scoping review is to give a reliable overview. And whether that overview relates to the use of questions, sometimes it may be that. It may sometimes relate to the use of different narrations. It may relate to the use of a chronological approach and so forth. The next one that we talk about is a conceptual review. And a conceptual review really is that you may, in your research, know that your study has 5 concepts it's interested in. So if you were looking at if your study was looking at the causes or the contributing social of contributing factors to violence, you would say, right, concept 1 is contributing factors, concept 2 is violence. So once you look at your topic and the focus of your topic, you pick out the key concepts and then you write your review based on those concepts. So an element of the review will just be writing about violence and the different research and so forth and so forth. That is a conceptual review. Now, the other part that we speak about is this, they call it the state of the art review, or sometimes they call it the state of the science review. And basically what those are is, well, the state of the art. So if you're studying something that's perceived to be an art form, a phenomena that is perceived to be an art, or a phenomena that's perceived to be scientific, then you would either be doing a state of the art review or a state of the science review, depending just on those 2 observations. Now, a state of the art review, be it a state of the art or state of the science, is literally about you reviewing the most current trends and theoretical positions, arguments that exist, and presenting them in the part of a literature review. So you are reviewing things, you are using critical review skills, narrative review skills, but the key part of a state of the art review is that it is interested primarily in the status of play in terms of the knowledge that exists as of now. So what are the predominant debates that exist in relation to a particular subject you're interested in? What is the conflicting or competing forms of evidence, and so forth? But the state of the art review is interested more in the here and now rather than in generic presentations of an overview of a topic. It's interested in the here and now. Then finally, folks, you will notice that I've included the quantitative or qualitative meta-analysis review. And this I don't enter into in this presentation, although I have a slide which gives you an interesting insight into what they are. The reason I don't enter into that is that for the most part, none of you, as part of your current courses of study, should be doing this as part of your chapter 2 that we're talking about. You shouldn't. Some of you may find yourselves doing it, but really it is outside the remit of the work that you're doing. But I've included it at the end, and also I've included it at the end, but also we will do what we call blast sessions. So later on this program, we'll have sessions where we speak to one topic and only one topic, and only those people who are affected by that topic will join. So meta-analysis review will be one of those things that exists in a blast session. Now, the following slides, all of them basically cover the typologies that I've referred to now, and I want you to retain these as you need to when you get back to accessing this. You should be able to retain this. I'm forgetting now that this is a recording, so I probably need to slow down the way that I run through each of them, so that when you're reviewing this, you have an opportunity to see it and to pause it and so forth. So I will take a quick moment of silence to just allow myself to page through each of the things that I have already described, but I will leave them up for a second or two just to allow you to pick up what you need to pick up. This typology will be covered in a later session. Please note that I have provided a reference at the bottom of this to give you an opportunity to be able to track up these different typologies. But once again, these are things that are written about all over the internet and should be accessible through a simple Google search. Once again, I also must state that I've mentioned typical typologies you would meet, but there are many more that have been coined and continue to be coined day in, day out. Do take note that, as I've already described, the scoping review is often used to give a broad-based overview of a topic, and I had indicated that it is often seen as being synonymous to a preliminary review. I will run through these. I think I see a level of repetition here. I think I've explained this already. Now, once we're aware of the different types of review possibilities that are available, the next step that we have and the next consideration for us is this thing to do with assessing your data sources. And by assessing your data sources, I'm saying to you, look, you now know the different ways in which you can approach the review process. But in it, when you have papers that sit in front of you and you have papers that are the center of your review process, you need to have an understanding about how you assess, you engage in that specific assessment of how good or how credible or how weak or how unreliable a piece of work is for inclusion or as part of the process of you reviewing it. So this is where we get to this set of things that relate to how you assess the data, you assess the literature that's in front of you. Basically, there are three commonly accepted ways in which people will assess the literature that they have. The first is you assess it by determining its relevance. And you're determining its relevance to the topic that you're looking at, its relevance to the subject field that you have declared as your interest. So you may actually find that there's a really great study, but if that study has limited relevance to you, then you would assess it negatively in relation to your particular interest. Then the next thing is you assess data by considering the strength of the evidence that has been used as a source of that data. And when I say strength of evidence, I am basically saying to you that different types of data or different types of literature carry with them inherent strengths and inherent weaknesses. So if you have your literature that you're reviewing, and that literature is a newspaper, it's newspaper articles, and someone else has literature that comes from academic journals, then we would be able to say, hey, the first piece of literature's weakness was in the fact that it comes from a source that is considered to have a lower strength of evidence than a published peer-reviewed article. Then the next thing that you evaluate your data by is through appraising some of the methodologies, using some appraisal methodologies that exist. So basically, there are templates that are out there that people will utilize so that they can ask the necessary questions when it comes to the things that they are reviewing. So I will briefly, at this moment, orientate you to examples of some of the three types of evaluatory possibilities that exist. As already indicated, the first way that you assess the data sources that you have and are reviewing is through assessing their relevance. That refers to you assessing or understanding the nature and extent to which each of these things that you're reviewing show a direct or inferred relatedness to the question that you are interested in or to the topic area that you've chosen. So the question here is, how does this literature that I'm reviewing relate to the thing that I'm interested in? Is it highly relevant? Is it not? Is it directly relevant, or is it relevant in a roundabout way? All those things help to build a sense of whether the work you're looking at is indeed relevant to you. Then, of course, there's this thing that they call seminal relevance. And seminal relevance really refers to the fact that there are some studies and some writers, authors that are known to be the gods in specific fields because they are of seminal importance. So you would not be able to write something about change management without mentioning Lewin, for example, because so when you assess something, you assess whether the contribution that it's threatening to make is one that looks like it would be of seminal importance. Is it the type of contribution that has shaped all our understanding of a particular topic or not? Then the other issue around relevance has to do with how related one piece of work is in relation to other pieces of work that you're looking at. So when you're reviewing paper A, you also review it in terms of how relevant that paper is to other things you are looking at, and does it all direct you to the same sort of area of interest. So beyond assessment by relevance, the next thing that you assess pieces of work by is through assessing the strength of evidence that was used as the primary method that the researchers or the authors of that paper look at. So I will put this in simple terms. Basically, there's an understanding that different types of or evidence that is collected in different ways will have different levels of credibility. So evidence that is collected, say, by me talking to an expert on a bus would be less reliable than evidence that I would collect from a formal study. And even in the studies themselves, there will be arguments that a study that is qualitative versus a quantitative one might have different levels of credibility depending on where you are sitting. But basically using a hierarchy, and there's a hierarchy called Sackett's hierarchy of evidence. And basically Sackett is an American researcher from, I think this was in 1984. He came up with a pyramid. and I'll show you the pyramid in a second. And that pyramid he used to detail and to give some direction about the different types of evidence, the different types of data sources, and how one data source is more superior in credibility than the other. So, and here's the piece of work. You will notice in basic terms, what he argued was that the lower on the pyramid, the closer to the ground, or the lower the type of data source is, the less credible it is compared to those things you find higher up. So in essence, if you have background information or an expert opinion turning you to turn left, and then another study comes, a cohort study says you must turn right, in terms of you debating which way you should go, one would expect that you would follow the evidence that has come from a cohort study over the evidence that has come from expert opinion, and so forth. So the higher up and the highest form of data, he argued, was the systematic review. So this, what you have in front of you, is called Sackett's hierarchy. I have not spoken to it in great detail here because we do cover it a bit later on in the series, but basically it's a method that is used. It's a pyramid, it's a hierarchy that people will utilize to determine, to make a head-to-head decision about whether to believe evidence from a cohort study versus evidence that's come from a randomized controlled trial. Now, in saying this, what Sackett did, and a group of people who worked with him, is that they said each of the different levels on that pyramid can be numbered. So the highest type of evidence, which was systematic reviews, he gave number 1. And then he said the lowest level of expert opinion is number 7. So if someone came to you and just out of nowhere said, "Hi, I'm reviewing a study whose information was based on level 1 data," you should be able to know that, so the data they have is a systematic, is data that was sourced from a systematic review. And if they said, my data that I'm looking at is level 7, then you would know that, so it's data that was collected from casual expert opinion as expressed by people in lectures and so forth. So what the next few slides do is they just help to show this numbering. And this numbering is it's basically, it's like a form of short abbreviated coding that people will use in this field. So instead of saying, my evidence was from a meta-analysis, I just say I had level 1 evidence. And that should be understood by whoever is listening to me, that I'm referring to evidence that came from a systematic review of randomized controlled trials or something at that level. These are the other levels that are there. Remember now, folks, this is Sackett's work. Sackett's work is one of a number of approaches that are used for assessing the data sources that you have. So when you carry out a literature review and you need to make a decision about how credible certain pieces of work are compared to another, you can lean on this. But of course, this is a very specific limitation, which some of you may have observed already. It only refers to quantitative types of studies. So its whole point of departure and the principles it follows are in essence almost the opposite of what qualitative research is. So you would find that if someone were to do a hierarchy and the hierarchy was based on qualitative thinking, they would have probably made expert opinion have the highest credibility because it is the one thing that gives you the most access to qualitative viewpoints. Then they would say something like a randomized controlled trial is less robust than information from an individual who tells you their subjective account. But that is To date, nobody has created a hierarchy for qualitative studies. So the one I'm showing you now is helpful for quantitative studies. Now, the next way of assessing the credibility or assessing your data source is by using different templates that share the types of questions you should ask when you're reading something. And here I've got one by Ian K. Crombie, and it's called it's from his book called The Dummy's Guide to Critical Appraisal. And basically it lists 10 things that you should ask when you look at a paper to get a sense of how good or how credible that paper is when you're doing the review. So you ask, is the study's research question relevant? Does the study add anything new? What type of research question does the study pose? Why is the study design appropriate for the research question? Did the study methods address the key potential sources of bias and so forth? And you will notice that those 10 questions are literally the sort of things that if someone said read a study and you were reading it and you just wanted to get a sense of whether you believe it or not, you like it or not, you would ask some of these 10 questions. So all these things that I've shown you so far help you to determine relevance. They help you to determine the strength of evidence, and they also helped you to determine the overall engagedness of the actual literature that you're reviewing. So when it comes to how you organize the content of your literature, I have already spoken to the fact that the different typologies give you some organizing principles. So if you are going with the chronological typology, then one would think that the principle you will follow to organize your work is I will start with the old and end with the new. And then if it's thematic, your principle you follow is around the topic or the issue, and so forth. So this slide here just revisits those things briefly, but what I want to then speak to is that when you're reviewing or doing a review, as in the formality of a proper review, as in chapter 2, many people can present that chapter either as one chapter, or depending on whether you have been asked to do a 400-page review and you think, okay, I will do the review, but I will make each of the themes a chapter on its own. Then you can have a review where the review is in the form of a series of chapters. And so that's what one of the ways in which a chapter would appear, a literature review would be. But for many of you, in fact, I can almost confidently say that every single one of you, the literature review that I'm talking about will be present as a single chapter. Of course, with every piece of work, written work that's structured, so when you write your chapter 2, it will come obviously in the format of everything that is presented as a type of essay comes in a format that has an introductory part, the body of what's going on, and the conclusions. And what I will try to do now, or what I've tried to do with the following slides, is just to give you some detail on what it is that you would expect to find in each of these sections. So in your introduction to a literature review, people will begin with giving a basic introduction of what a literature review is. They would restate once again what the generic topic that they're interested in is, and a very brief reference in identifying why the topic that they've chosen is important. They would also maybe acknowledge that they are carrying out the literature review because they are aware of conflicts in the theory, conflicts in methodology. They believe that there's gaps in research and so forth. Then, of course, you would indicate how you went about collecting data, how you identified it, and what criteria were used in your review to decide which papers were in or which papers were out. And then, of course, you can indicate with the inclusion or exclusion criteria what the scope of your review is. And by scope, basically saying you are stipulating where your space of interest begins and where it stops. So sometimes people will reflect the scope by saying my review only focuses on papers from 1999 onwards or something of that nature. So that's the introductory part of a review. Then in the body, remember now the body will be directed by the type of review principles you are following. Are you going for a chronological review? Are you going for a critical review? Are you going for a thematic review, a narrative review, and so forth? But in any case, whatever choice you choose, you will have to organize your things into your review into paragraphs, and those paragraphs can either be paragraphs that depict chronologies. So you might have a paragraph that looks at all the research from the 1970s, or you have paragraphs that look at themes. So you stick to that theme, or you have paragraphs that look at critical questions, as one would expect in a critical review. Then, of course, within that, you now engage in the debative part, where you give an overview of the paper. Once you've given an overview of the paper that you're looking at, you say what it was seeking to find, what conclusions it drew, and of course, if the paper stands out by virtue of having particular strengths or particular weaknesses, or if it contradicts any other pre-existing understanding, this is your opportunity to mention it within the body. Now, within the body, with each of them in the body, the things you ask are within each of the paragraphs that I've spoken about. You talk about the accepted facts, the agreed and accepted knowledge, what is the most echoed type of knowledge, what are the shortcomings in each of the things that you have looked at, what are the limitations, what does it say in terms of further research that needs to be done to clarify a similar thing. So, but you do this overview for each subtopic. If your subtopic is based on a theme, you would do what you see in front of you for that theme. If your subtopic is based on a critical question, you would do what I have in front of you, but in related to a critical question. So then the conclusion of your literature review then talks about you acknowledging much more clearly whether there is very clear and outstanding agreements in the literature, or when there is very clear and outstanding disagreements in the literature, and whether those disagreements are being resolved by current research that you're aware of, and you make some general conclusions about the direction in which the literature or the research suggests your topic is heading. Are there any future or further questions that need to be asked or explored in relation to that? Then, of course, you identify the gaps that have been shown to exist by your review, and within that, you position your research. You then say, these are what the gaps were. The study that you carried out speaks to this particular gap. So once you have done that, then you've done the concluded bit of your literature review. Now, I've put together some further reading for you and hope that you'll be able to pursue this. But beyond this, this presentation actually has other pieces of information I'd like you to have. And they are the sort of questions that people typically ask. But in the fact that this is presented without you being able to question me in the moment, I've provided these as additional notes. And you'll find these at the back end of the file that we sent to you. And I thought I would end by just sharing something to encourage you to be as inquisitive as you ever need to be, They say if you ask a stupid question, you may feel stupid by virtue of that question. But if you don't ask a stupid question, you remain stupid. So don't at any point think that anything you don't know now should be kept secret because you don't know it. And on that basis, we have a chat. We've got a chat box that allows you to put in your questions, and we'll get back to them and answer them. And of course, your questions don't always have to make sense, because clearly you may be asking a question because you're confused. The job is for me to make sense of those questions and make sure that the answers do make sense. And on that note, I will bid you farewell from this session and see you at the next session. Please be mindful that there are more slides to this presentation, but you will see them when we send you the version that is for you to look at. I thank you for your attention, and I hope that this has not taken up too much of your mental energy. And remember, folks, with things like literature reviews, you can get the theory of it, but all of it starts to make sense when you look at existing reviews that have been done by others, and you're able to kind of get a sense of the extent to which certain things happen within a typical review. So in short, I'm asking you to identify review literatures by others and have a quick look. Thank you very much. Have a great day going forward.